Forward TV. The world is thinking.
For those of you who do not know, I'm Bill Kelly, the president of the CUNY Graduate Center, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Great Issues Forum. The Graduate Center is the doctorate granting wing of the City University of New York. We educate 4,500 students across 31 academic programs, and we are home to 29 research centers and institutes. And along with our teaching and research commitments, we discharge our obligation to serve the citizens of this great city by mounting an extensive series of free public programs. Our objective in doing so is consistent with CUNY's role as the nation's largest integrated public university, and that is to vitalize the public sphere, to encourage the kind of informed discussion essential to the health of the democratic polis. The marquee event of our programming is the Great Issues Forum. Each year, the series explores critical issues of our time through a single thematic lens. Our current focus is power. This is the fifth and final evening in the series for this year. In our first conversation, Mary Robinson, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Nicholas Kristof considered the subject of political power, its limits, its capacities, its responsibilities. In Great Issues 2, Nobel Prize-winning economists Joseph Stiglitz, distinguished journalists Naomi Klein, and Hernando de Soto, president of the Institute for Liberty and Democracy, discussed economic power, its exercise, and its vulnerabilities in globalized circumstance. This was shortly after the market turned south, and it was an interesting conversation. At Great Issues 3, Nobel Prize-winning poet Derek Walcott joined Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Tom Stoppard in conversation about cultural power, the role of art in bridging political, ideological, religious, and geographic distance. Last month at Great Issues 4, Tom Ricks, General Barry McCaffrey, and Alex DeWall considered the uses and abuses of military power in the context of peacekeeping. The common denominator of these four conversations was the transnational character of contemporary life, the global interconnection of our destinies, the limitations of unilateral response. It is appropriate that this year's final forum addresses higher education and its transformative capacities. Knowledge and power have always been reciprocally linked, and never more so than now. Ours is a world in which knowledge has replaced material resource as the engine of economic development, and universities are a primary source of the generation and diffusion of that knowledge. But universities are seriously strained by competitive markets, limited resources, intensified demand for services, the conflicting mandates of excellence and access. The stakes are extraordinarily high. Prosperity, health, social stability, the sustainability of the planet depend upon our capacity to educate, to generate new knowledge. But the challenges that confront us are as vast as the opportunities we foresee. This evening we'll talk about those challenges and opportunities with four distinguished panelists. Deborah Davis is professor of sociology at Yale, a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and a founding editor of the Yale-China Health Journal. She's been the director of academic programs at the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization, chair of the Council of East Asian Studies, and director of graduate programs in both Asian Studies and Sociology. Her most recent book, published by Stanford University Press, is entitled Creating Wealth and Poverty in Post-Socialist China. James J. Duderstadt is President Emeritus and University Professor of Science and Engineering at the University of Michigan. A graduate of Yale and Caltech, Dr. Duderstadt joined the faculty in Michigan in 1968 and served as Dean of Engineering and as Provost, as well as President of the university. His expertise is intimidatingly vast, ranging from nuclear science, engineering, applied physics, and computational research to science policy and higher education. His many prestigious awards include the E.O. Lawrence Award for Excellence in Nuclear Research, the Arthur Holly Compton Prize for Outstanding Teaching, the Reginald Wilson Award for National Leadership in Achieving Diversity, and the National Medal of Technology for exemplary service to the American nation. Dr. Duderstadt is currently the director of the University of Michigan's program in Science, Technology, and Public Policy, as well as the Millennium Project, a research center exploring the social impact of over-the-horizon technologies. Enrique Dussel Peters is a professor of economics at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, where he directs the China-Mexico Institute. His teaching and research have been focused on economic development and political economy. He is the recipient of many honors and awards, including the 1998 James Street Visiting Latin American Scholar Prize, awarded by the Association of Evolutionary Economics, and the National University Prize for Young Academics. His work has been widely published in Mexico and across the world, and he is broadly recognized as an authority on globalization and on the relation between higher education and economic development. Lizhong is president of East China Normal University. Dr. Yu received his PhD in environmental magnetism from the University of Liverpool. He has published extensively in that field and has received many awards for his scholarship. He has won grants from the Royal Society, the British Council, Japan's University President's Fund, and the Lever-Yulm Trust. Before assuming the presidency of East China Normal, Dr. Yu served as president of Shanghai Normal University. His many affiliations include the Science and Technology Board of the Chinese Ministry of Education, the Executive Council of the Chinese Anti-Disaster Association, and the Chinese Higher Education Society. He has led one of China's most vital and dynamic universities with great distinction. We're very proud to welcome him and the rest of our panelists this evening. Two final matters before we begin. First, I'm pleased to note that funding for the Great Issues Forum was provided by the Carnegie Corporation, presented to Chancellor Matthew Goldstein. We're grateful to Carnegie and Vartan Gregorian, as well as to Chancellor Goldstein. And second, permit me please to remind you to turn off your cell phones, any other devices that beep, squeak, or talk that you may have with you. If you need to Twitter, perhaps you can reserve that until the break. So please, let us begin our conversation. Michael's going to help me with my microphone, or you would not hear me at all. Thank you. Can you hear me? Good. There we are. Jim, let me begin with you. Last month, you delivered the Dies Academicus address at the University of Vienna's 644th anniversary. I mean, think about that. From 644 years of university history. It's extraordinary. It's a wonderful address, and I want to begin with a striking observation that you made. You argued that, and I'm quoting Jim here, in a sense, many of our universities are in the wrong place, where populations are aging and perhaps even declining rather than young and growing. At the same time, developing nations are overwhelmed by the higher education needs of expanding young populations. I want to split for a minute those issues in half and begin with the current situation of higher education in developed economies. And their circumstance you describe as being caught between massification, league tables, and tax relief. Could you elaborate a bit about that three-headed monster and talk about why universities in U.S. and Europe are feeling so strained?
Certainly, but I should also say that the reason I agreed to do the Vienna talk was because I was promised the next night that the rector would take my wife and I to the Vienna State Opera, where they were performing Eugene Onegin with Seiji Ozawa, and then afterwards to the Hotel Soccer for a real tour.
Soccer tour, absolutely. You drive a hard bargain,
that's
my
right.
friend.
Every couple of years, I have the pleasure of hosting with the former rector of the University of Geneva a little gathering of university leaders from around the world come together in an old European hotel overlooking Lake Geneva and the Chateau Chalon to kind of compare notes. And you know, one of the amazing things is that whether it's from the developed economies, the developing economies, I think most people are recognizing the impact of the global knowledge-driven economy, the degree to which economic prosperity, social well-being, security depends on educated people, their ideas, their innovation, their entrepreneurial skills, and hence upon opportunities for education. But the perspectives of those challenges are almost totally different between mature economies and developing economies. The mature economies are being challenged, as you suggested, to both massify, that is, to provide educational opportunity very broadly across their populations, stretching actually university systems that were originally designed to educate only the elite. And they're being challenged to do this at world-class quality as determined by the London Times ranking or US News and World Report, what they call league tables. And they're being challenged by aging populations which would like them to achieve both and reduce tax burdens at the same time. Yeah. That is, their priorities are retirement security, health, and tax relief. Just a comment on the developing world, because they too understand the imperatives of the knowledge economy. They too wish to achieve broad educational opportunity, and they wish to do it with quality. But in contrast with the aging societies of Europe, North America, parts of Asia, they have this huge explosion of young people that see this as their future. It's estimated over 100 million people in the world today are ready for college without any college existing. And that number could explode to 200, 300 million over the next 20 years. It would require one CUNY or University of Michigan to be open every week to satisfy that. So here we have the two dilemmas kind of side by side. The mature economies seeking to achieve both broad educational opportunity, very high quality, and reduce tax burdens. And on the other side of the coin, the developing economies trying to educate enormous numbers of people, but doing so by, at this stage, trying to adopt the models of Western societies, campus-based paradigms that may be almost irrelevant to the challenges that they face. And so I think we've got two very interesting questions to explore during this conversation.
Yeah. Let me stop there and turn to the other side of the coin, and then we'll put this in conversation. Those developing nations that you talk about, I'm interested in the ways in which massification, league tables, resource or tax relief play out there, and I want to begin with China, if I may, for both Deborah and Lizhong. As in so many other things, China has had a remarkable record of achievement. In 1998, 3.4 million Chinese citizens attended university. Last year, that number was 21.5 million. Speaks to a vast investment at national, provincial, local levels, been a driver for growth and a source of justifiable pride. Today, front page Wall Street Journal, long piece by Ian Johnson about difficulties and strains in Chinese higher education system, not entirely dissimilar to what Jim was just talking about, but in some ways the other side of the developed nation coin. Johnson writes, a quote from the journal, "At the system's peak are 75 elite universities lavishly funded by China's central government." I don't know that any university administrator ever feels lavishly funded, but leave that go for the moment. Because these schools' expansion has been controlled by Beijing, they have been largely exempt from financial problems. Beneath the elite universities are 2,100 others where the vast majority of Chinese undergraduates study. Almost all are saddled with virtually unserviceable debts, debts that arose from expansion, building campuses, expanding faculties. How does the challenge of mass education, at the same time desiring elite world-class university research, how does that play out in China from your point of view? And then I want to talk to Deborah about it as well. Lizhong, perhaps you can begin.
I think this is a big phenomenon in Chinese higher education, because during the last 10 years, all the student enrollment in China is more than doubled through 10 years. So every year it's about a 15% increase of the enrollment of the university. And also the number of university and the space of the university expanded rapidly. Yeah. I think this is the main reason is, the first is the requirement of the student and the student family. You know, in the traditional, the Chinese culture, most of family want their kids have well educated, especially they got chance to go to the university. So this is a big demand. In early 1990, there's only 3.4% of the college-age student has got the chance to go to the university. But now is 23.3% of the college-age student they has been enrolled in the university. So I think this is a huge changes for the higher education, and also that is to meet the requirement of the knowledge-based society, because you see the job is, the attitude is changes, and also they need a skilled person and the knowledge, the personnel to do everything. Mm-hmm. So I think this is a very important progress for the higher education in China. But at the same time, how to control the quality?
Yeah.
I think that is more critical issues in China. At the first stage, because the expansion of the higher education not based on the high input or the investment by the government. The most of the new campus was developed by the bank loan, debit. Right. So not only you say it's the university supported by the local government, get the loan from the bank. I think all the university, like my university, because we are supported by the central government, we also built our campus by the bank loan. Yeah. But actually, we are not worried about that. The government say, we encourage you to have a faster development because we need more students to have the chance to go to the university. But the government at this moment, we cannot pay everything. Right. So you can do.
Similar kind of twining here.
Yeah. So all the university has a debit now. Yeah. But actually we see the achievement after 10 years because we solve lots of problems if we are not have more students in the university. We have more bigger problems for the employment and for the economic development.
Understood.
Yeah.
Deborah, from your point of view, as an expert both on China and on globalization, how do you read the massification table question in China?
In the Chinese case, the first thing I would take issue with the Wall Street Journal piece, the debt. There's an issue there, but it's not struggling. And I think it goes back to a question which you haven't raised, which is how it's linked to secondary education. Yep. So this big massification at the higher level is because China did such a good job at the lower levels. Right. And so this is equally important to watch, is how over a very short period of time, they universalized the junior high school, and then once you unify that, you're then faced with this senior high school piece. Yep. So I think that's, in actually thinking about the US also, is the backward linkages I would hope we are going to discuss also, because the roots are there, the issues are there, this aging question, the tax base, and I feel that in the American case, this is one of our great weaknesses in this global age, is that America has disinvested at the secondary level in particular. So this factoid that we're told all the time, that at fourth grade, Americans test in the top 1 to 4, and by the time we get to age 16 or grade 2 of the secondary, we're down at 25 and 26. So when I look at this developing world, developed world, I actually would create further countries in Europe, for example, where they have a much more integrated sense of where secondary education should be and how it feeds. And then you do have the issue, what should the university do? I think Americans as a society hasn't, for obvious reasons, hasn't thought very systematically. The Chinese part, that's the last thing I'll say, was I first went to China in '78 on a National Academy of Science exchange, and then I've gone every year since. And last year I taught at Beijing University for 6 months. And what's the bottom line is that the last 10 years in China has been so exciting. We just feel this forward thrust, and there are problems, but each year it's progress. You don't see anything, I don't see really anything that's going backwards. Yep. And maybe you can't say that across the developing world, but we certainly see in a lot of East Asian societies that upward thrust, which is supported both by a developmental state, which puts its money systematically in a coherent secondary school education built on mastery of core subjects and of developing teachers, paired with parents who are willing to spend 1/4 of their education on their child's education from kindergarten on. So there's this investment, the personal investment strategy that we often critique as undermining public education in the United States. I would say in the Chinese case, Singapore case, Korea, Taiwan, the places that I've been familiar with, I don't see them, I think they can run in parallel and create synergy.
Thanks. Enrique, the Mexican example is somewhat different from China. There was a point in the 80s where levels of investment, numbers of students, degree holders were relatively parallel in China and Mexico. Chinese takeoff takes place. Mexico has not invested in the same way in higher education. Wonderful university, one of the great universities in the world, but difficult times in meeting all of the student demands. 80% of people who apply are not able to find a seat at your university. Can you talk a bit about the challenges that Mexico confronts in its responses to it vis-a-vis mass education and at the same time preserving the excellence that's embodied in your university?
Yes, of course. I think it would be interesting and important to remember that we speak a lot of times on this process of globalization, and it's one of these catchwords that everybody uses, but a lot of times there is little specificity of what we're discussing. It's not the topic of what we're going to discuss, but it would be interesting to remind, at least to try to determine the process of globalization in space and time. No? And there, I believe, and working together with some colleagues at UNAM, but also with other friends, to try to understand globalization as a rather recent process in the last 3 or 4 decades, and understood probably as a result of 2 important waves and factors. One, which is understood under the catchword of flexible production. This is since the late 1960s, 1970s, mainly in the OECD countries, you have an increasing flexibilization of demand, but also of supply of factories, huge factories that become smaller and smaller because you want to have a small car with green paint and dark dots. No? And for that, you need, again, a lot of flexibilization. And the other factor which is relevant would be what is understood as these global commodity chains. This is the possibility, historically, I would say absolutely new, that a firm like Walmart says, I want to make, or I need 1 million pair of socks to be produced through brokers in Hong Kong, to be produced in Tijuana, in San Pedro Sula, in Shanghai, and to be consumed in New York, in Mexico City, and Berlin. This is new. No, this did not happen even 50 years ago and not that massively today. So from this perspective, what is relevant, and to try to make this very brief, what is relevant is that the territories, which could be a county, but also a whole country like the United States or Mexico, the territories require massive preparations in this process of globalization. If the territories are not prepared, they will be competing systemically with other territories, and they will lose very quickly. And in this perspective of global commodity chains, the weakest link will determine the result. This is, if you are extremely weak in higher education, you will very soon have serious deficits compared to other countries. Getting back then to the question, Mexico has unfortunately been very weak in preparing in this process of globalization. I would say mainly because since the late 1980s, the Mexican government has taken a stance, and the bet of the Mexican government was towards privatization and expecting that the private sector and that private universities would increase the number of students, but parallel to the growth of students in the private sector, in private universities, parallel to this, R&D would also increase. And unfortunately, this has not happened. Our university, UNAM, where I work, for bet, I would say, still accounts for almost 50% of Mexico's R&D. This does not speak so much of our university, of course it does, but it tells a lot more of the rest than of us. No?
Yeah. Let me press that a bit on this question of privatization and the two sectors of Mexican education. This is from The Economist. UNAM matters not just because of its size, but also because it was for years an engine of social mobility, a place where students from provincial secondary schools could mix with the children of politicians and those of the metropolitan middle class. Nowadays, many of the children of the elite head to the capital's top private universities to study economics or political science, but UNAM remains the only educational institution that does high-quality basic research in the sciences. This piece is suggesting a challenge to social mobility in Mexico. And I wondered if you could launch us into some consideration about how higher education is meeting or failing that challenge of social mobility, which at least in the United States has always been one, from the land-grant days on, one of the great claims of higher education, creating opportunity, possibilities of moving from class to class. What's that situation like from your perspective in Mexico now, Enrique?
Yes, of course, because probably one of the main qualitative results in Mexico from this process of globalization in the last 20 years has been a dramatic process of polarization. This is, you could not say that nobody has won. No, there has been households, firms, branches and territories within Mexico that have been doing very well, but the vast majority have not participated in this process. And this I could tell you very clearly, anecdotically, if you want to. I teach for 15 years at the graduate and undergraduate level in economics, and from our perspective, the level of the new students, incoming students, has increased dramatically. You say, wow, well, this is personally very good if you want to. The problem is that what we have seen is that you have increasingly people from the middle and higher classes coming to public universities because they cannot pay for private universities. No? And so you have an increasing exclusion of lower classes that cannot study. No, they cannot study at public universities because there are no scholarships and because it's not a matter of participating in a public university which is free, but you're simply not getting an income for 4 or 5 years. So I would agree very much with that statement.
Jim, you've led one of the country's great public universities. How would you characterize the prospect of social mobility? American universities as bastions of opportunity or bastions of privilege in this sense?
Or engines of inequality, as Katie Haycock says. Yeah. My university was, in many ways, the first truly public university created, in the words of one of our early presidents, to provide an uncommon education for the common man. And we were able to do that because of a fair degree of support from the public sector. When I arrived at Michigan in the 1960s, about 70% of our support came from state government. Today, it has dropped below 6% of our budget, and you challenged me with my comment that over those 30 to 40 years, I've seen our university evolve from a state-supported to a state-assisted to a state-related to a state-located, and we have campuses in Europe and China and so forth, so we're only remaining a state-molested institution. The challenging part of that is we're not alone. The University of Virginia is tracking right along with us. Right behind us is Illinois, Wisconsin, Texas, and then eventually the University of California. So what's happened is that across this country, the importance of public higher education providing opportunity has kind of fallen off the agenda. My university today enrolls only 10% of its students that have Pell Grants. The average family income of our entering freshman class is about $120,000 a year. So we're not exactly a university, you know, and I think it's a very serious issue that we need to come to grips with. But of course, the horrifying part of it is I don't think it's entered public consciousness. And that's why we're beginning to fall behind Europe. We're about where China is right now in terms of the fraction of our high school students that go on to college, in fact. you folks have made remarkable progress and you're moving faster than you may think. But that has to get on the radar scope of our leaders. I think with the new president it has, but it's going to take an awful lot of work to get that on the radar scope, particularly of our state houses.
And given current fiscal circumstances, an even bigger challenge. Lizhong, this question of social mobility and stratification, and I'd like Deborah's take on this as well. You've had this remarkable experiment and experience in the last 10 years of this great boom. What's your sense at this point about the ways in which Chinese higher education has contributed to social mobility, or is it simply installed another form of stratification along, or too early to know? I realize that at this point we're talking about a new experience, but what's your thinking about that?
I think the development of higher education is a big impact on the social mobility. Yeah. Not only because we have the training, the students, which can be highly contribute to the change of the society, but also you see the capability of the universities is dramatically increased. So that will be a good issues for the development of China, because the university plays more and more important role for the social reform and the progress. Yeah.
Given the competitive nature of admission to elite Chinese universities, to what extent is there class diversity in the students who are admitted, because so much is required? I mean, Deborah's earlier point about significant investment in primary and secondary education. Yeah. But how would you categorize the social mix of students who find their way to elite universities as opposed to the other sectors of Chinese higher education?
I think for the higher education, you see, we selected the students is based on the national exam. Right. So it doesn't matter where you come from and then which your family, the situation of your family. It's based on the exam, the score of the exam.
But meritocracies, to some extent, are dependent upon the access to the information that will enable you to succeed on the exam. Is that access broadly available because of reforms in primary and secondary education?
Yes, I think the difference, or we say it's unequal for the student, is started from primary education and the secondary education. The people living in the countryside or living in the poor, the regions, or even the family is a lower class family, they possibly have a less chance to get the more new information, and then also the primary education is different in the rural area and in the metropolitan area. So that is produce some the problems for the student at the beginning, you see. So even we say it's quite fair for the student to be selected to the university because it's based on the exam and based on your score. But if you consider about the start for the different students from different region and the family, there will be some problems.
Sure. Yeah. Deborah, you're a student of stratification in general and unequal cultural capital and its distributions. You've been a student of this extraordinary Chinese experiment. What's your sense of the ways in which this great boom in university enrollment has affected stratification, will affect it? How do you read it?
Well, there are a couple of general points I would stress for the comparative piece, and one is the size of China at 1.3 billion, so that below these 75 key points, there's a vast number of universities at the provincial level and below that. So I think one of the ways we want to, if we look about inequality, is to do it province by province. And I have basically been very positively affected that this huge growth, if we do it province by province, my only rural survey is in Yunnan province, and that's where I really have understanding of that supposedly backward regional. And what impresses you is it's not backward at all. No, it's not Beida, and I taught at Beida, which is in many ways very much like Yale. I was struck many ways by the students the same. So I've experienced this elite one, but my research has been at many levels. And so the first thing I would emphasize is that the Chinese case, many provinces of China are almost as large as Mexico, and they all are larger than any European country. So I think if we actually want to measure it, that's the issue. And they have grown very fast at this provincial level, but they are on the back of a very good secondary education. And the way in which the secondary education operates is also by competitive exams. It's like everything with Stuyvesant and Hunter. And these kids are coming from each county. So that means they're not competing against the kids in the next province over, or even the core city, the metropolitan city. Every single province, every single county of China, 2,400, has a key point middle school. These key point middle schools are exceptionally good. They offer a superb curriculum. When you visit them or you've seen them, they are very simple. They can be very, very stripped down. The dormitory with the 6 kids stepping, 12 hours a day away from their parents. But both my colleagues and my students have come up these channels. Those channels are in place. So I think China's comparative advantage, I don't think there's another country in the world, in the developing world, if we do by GDP per capita, that has this national structure out there reaching literally every village where the exceptional child will be culled and sent. And there will be no parent or village, if a child makes it to that key point middle school, who is not going to be kept in the school. The number of children who drop out of senior high school in these key points is trivial. And then the next step is this national exam, and it has many inequalities built into it. The cutoff score is higher for the poorest areas than so Shanghai, Beijing have lower, etc. But what struck us at Beida last year, and my husband was there too teaching, in our classes, we all had students who came from villages where parents were illiterate. And I just share one anecdote. One of the students who wrote me, who's from a western province where her parents are primary school graduate workers in this godforsaken mining town. Again, she got to the key point. She now is in physics, a major at Beida. Then she got into mountain climbing and rock climbing. So she just wrote me that what she's doing is there's a club that she's been able to join. She was able by tutoring to get the money, and so now she's rock climbing. So I think that while as a sociologist, and we can talk about that because I also study that, there's the cultural capital, social capital disadvantage. There is stratification. But if I put it in the larger comparative perspective, I think China is a model in many ways of how one actually can expand very rapidly without having dilution of quality at the top, which I understand is the Mexican challenge. That the very top in this process of globalization and the competitive has made it very hard for Mexico to hold that open door at the top. And I think China, for the variety of reasons, has been able to do that.
Let's talk about that open door at the top, Jim, and then Enrique. I mean, that's a staggering statistic that you just gave us, that the average income of your students' family is $120,000 a year. It points to the kind of disparity between the large research institution and branch campuses. But you also talk about another disparity. This is a quote from I think this is from Globalization and Higher Education. These flagship institutions, speaking of the great publics like Michigan and Wisconsin, Virginia, and so forth, these flagship institutions now find themselves caught between the rock of declining state support and the hard place of the predatory rich private universities. A serious competitive imbalance in the marketplace exists. You say that it would be a national disaster if the public research university were to deteriorate to the point in which research and advanced education of world-class quality could only occur in the 20 to 30 wealthiest private universities. Can you expand a bit on the nature of that disaster, why it would be a disaster, and how we can avoid it?
It was written a year ago this spring, okay, and maybe we're not quite so worried as
that's where my next question was going.
But the dilemma we have is the following, that the public research universities do 80% of the research of this country. They produce 80% of the scientists, the engineers, the doctors, the lawyers, the knowledge professionals. They are owned by states, however, which really don't care about that. If they pay attention to higher education at all, and with aging populations, most of what they care about are health care, prisons, and tax relief. But if they care about higher education, it's primarily on baccalaureate degree production. The federal government, however, does care and care deeply, as you heard probably yesterday in President Obama's speech to the National Academy of Sciences. But the problem is the federal government has no institutional strategy. They have a strategy for financial aid for students, for research that goes to investigators, but not for preserving institutions at world-class quality. And in that sense, they are different than almost every country in the world today that has a national strategy to build or sustain universities of world-class quality in advanced education and research because of its importance to their economy. So the great fear that we have is that, in fact, left only to the priorities of the states, we will lose that world-class quality in the backbone of this nation's intellectual capacity. And that's, I might say, is a view shared by Vartan Gregorian at the Carnegie Institute. Lamar Alexander 3 days ago gave a major speech about that. So it's beginning to get to people's awareness, but it would be a dramatic change in national policy to do what, for example, Europe has done with the Bologna process and really try to build and sustain institutions of world-class quality.
Let me spin that a bit, if I may. Mm-hmm. One of the most quoted lines anywhere in people write about higher education is this again from The Economist. America's system of higher education is the best in the world. That's because there is no system. And The Economist goes on to talk about flexibility, diversity, and the fact that American universities are, quote, less dependent on the dead hand of the state. And yet, what you've just said argues for a strategy and a plan. How do you reconcile those two positions?
The two data points. One was the document that Abraham Lincoln signed at the beginning of the Civil War, at a time when the nation was in great disarray, that created the land-grant universities, a new type of university which really achieved massification of quality in our society. The second data point is, I think, the greatest success story in American higher education, which is the California Master Plan, which created the most powerful system of universities in the world, but it was a highly strategic plan, highly differentiated, very similar to what China is trying to do right now. So I, being from probably the most autonomous of all public universities, fight to the end for that independence and autonomy, but I think it has to be within at least a process, a structure, which tries to realize the importance of these institutions and the kind of investments that are necessary to make.
And it hasn't been true that there has been no government engagement or plan at critical moments. The Morell Act, the GI Bill, the decision to create the National Institutes of Science, peer review, the Pell Grants.
That's right.
There have been these kind of strategic engagements that suggest a kind of vision.
That's right. And I think, that's an issue that's before the nation today. Yeah. We need to reconsider that.
Yeah. Enrique, in terms of the reconsideration of these questions, you're at an elite university. I mean, in the same city where UNAM is located, there is the University of Mexico City. I mean, there is a city university as well. Is there an argument to be made for consolidating resources, for focusing resources, and I want to ask Lizhong about this as well, in a relatively small number of institutions because of the need for nations to become innovative, to spur economic growth? Is there an argument to be made if you have to, against the spreading of resources in other ways? What's the thinking in Mexico about, or at least your view of it, about that question of consolidating resources in elite institutions as opposed to distributing resources more broadly?
Yes, of course. I would say there is a big need of trying to argue from the perspective of a strategic priority, no? Because, again, fortunately, I would say nobody today would argue against education or nobody would argue against higher education even, no? For good or for bad, note the irony, no? The difficulty is the following. In the current process of globalization, not only education, but also higher education, but I would say in general production processes, etc., are increasingly capital intensive, no? Today, for producing tomatoes, we did a study on tomatoes a few months ago, people in Amsterdam can produce 16 times more tomatoes than someone in Mexico waiting for the rain. If it rains, you produce tomatoes. If it doesn't rain, you don't produce. But you can produce with computers and high tech 16 times more. No? So this is at the production level, and this is at the high education level of too. So again, everybody, or there is nobody I know that would argue against higher education, but I would say I hope this is also clear and noted in the budget. No? If you don't see it in the budget, then we're speaking of something different. And there in the budget, I see, in the case at least of most Latin American countries and in Mexico, I see very little. I see very little priorities and a strategic perspective of higher education, A, and then B, I would say there is very little, the other challenge beyond the budget is the link between innovation, R&D, and society and firms. No? In the best of the cases, you might have a highly innovative small group, hopefully domestically, maybe imported, but not linked to the rest of the society. So you have patents, but they are absolutely useless in the best of the cases. They use them somewhere else. No? This is a very important case in some parts of Mexico. And again, and finally, trying to argue for not only higher education in general, but very specifically for public higher education. There is this professor at the MIT, Michael Piore and Lester. Very recently they wrote a book on the processes of innovation, and they tried to argue of innovation as an interpretative process, and they speak of closed rooms. They speak of the need of interacting between different societies, engineers, administrators, economists, policy makers, and there is a different rationality beyond strictly the market efficiency and prices. You need time, you need to have some time to discuss. He even speaks of these cocktail parties, no? For interacting. This is jokingly, but he tries to demonstrate it how through these cocktail parties, how innovations are developed. No? And so again, these cocktail parties can only be developed, this would be the argument, in public places and rooms, closed rooms. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult, and this has been very difficult to argue currently or in the last 20 years in most of Latin America.
Okay. Oh. Closed rooms, open rooms, is this an issue in China in terms of encouraging innovation relative to consolidation of resources in relatively small places? How does that, I mean, China seems to have done both and in a lot of ways. But what's the conversation that takes place to promote this kind of decision making?
Yeah. I think the access and the excellence have always been concerned by the development of higher education at the same time. So I have mentioned about, for the last 10 years, you see the process of the mass higher education is going. But at the same time, there also a number of projects is initiated by the government, the central government, to encourage the best university to go more fast to the world-class university. Actually, for the long time, we have kind of priority strategies for develop leading universities in China. So there is the various type of universities. So the top group we call the 985 project university.
Right.
That is in 1990, the May of 1998. The president of China, the former president of China, Jiang Zemin, gave a speech in Beijing University, and he said we need a number of world-class or the well-known universities in the world. So the government should give more support to a certain number of the university to make its growth quick. So far, there are 39 universities in this group. Of course, our university is one of this group. And then we have another project we call the 211 project. That is for the 21st century, we should develop 100 universities. It's more advanced than other universities. Right. So can be more resources input into this university. So far, I think is 107 university in this group. ECNU is also in this group. So that is we call the priority strategies for the develop the leading university. But for the other university, they still have quite lots of support from the central government or for the local government to maintain the university quality. They can receive the resources from the different way for how to improve the teaching quality. You can apply different funding from the government and to improve the training program for the graduate students. And they have a number of projects you can apply for that. So I think this is a strategy, so keep the fast development of the mass higher education. But at the same time, to more concentrate some high quality resources to support a number of universities to grow faster and to meet the requirement of the high standard of the education around the world.
Are you concerned that current economic circumstances will make it more difficult to sustain that strategy?
But actually, this year, we received more funding from the government.
Just like
it's about 10% increase. So this is a kind of investment to, you see, the raised the economic development. So that is also very happy for the university president, because especially in this critical time, we get more money and we can make it more high.
Only CUNY keeps track with China, right?
China, absolutely, absolutely. We are linked in that regard. That same question to you, Jim. I mean, on one hand, you alluded to the new administration and apparently a greater commitment to higher education, public education in general. At the same time, we're in the midst of difficult funding models for endowment-driven universities, for tuition-generated universities, and for state-supported universities. Michigan, with 6% coming from the state is largely irrelevant to your scheme. But looking across the nation, how do you see the fiscal crisis playing out in this divide that we were talking about before, the rock and the hard place?
Well, you know, the saying that many people have stated and reminded us of is you never want to waste the opportunity of a crisis. And maybe this is an opportunity for us to step back a little bit and look at what the nation needs, what resources are available, how best to do that. As you may know, and in fact there was an article in Time magazine last week about it, the state legislature in Michigan, as kind of a Washington monument proposal, suggested that maybe they could save $320 million by just making the University of Michigan go private. Well, I don't think that's the issue, but I think there is a very serious issue about what do we mean by a public university in the 21st century, with greater mobility, with national needs balanced against regional needs, with the disappearance of state boundaries as having the political impact they had before. And maybe some of these institutions are going to become more nation-like. In fact, at the conference we held in Switzerland 2 years ago, there was even the discussion about possible universities beginning to redefine their public purpose in global terms, what we called universities in the world and of the world. And with Universitas 21, a consortia of universities. There was a step toward that. Some of the for-profits, the mergers and acquisitions are moving in that direction. The British Open University is essentially a global university. Right. So I think the crisis may elevate the ability of university leaders and the people that are interested in these institutions to try new paradigms that might not have been possible during more static times.
Deborah, let me shift the subject of the conversation a little bit. Time's winged chariot sounds loudly in my ear. Globalization, internationalization, the kinds of things that Gleon's looked at, the issues that Jim just raises. To what extent does it become a force to encourage collaboration among universities, particularly research universities? And to what extent does it become a driver of competition? Competition for resources, for faculty, for students, for position in the world. How do you read that divide?
It's simplistic. I thought about it a little bit. For the individual, it's an opportunity. Collaboration is something I think that's quite easy for us to do, project by project. So whether it's in engineering or the kind of projects that I've involved in, it goes swimmingly. And this era of greater integration, the collapse of these boundaries, a commodity chain approach, for the individual who flows along it or the project who flows along it, it's been superbly empowering. And so partnership in this time of reallocation of resources from previously richer places to poorer places or stratified within a richer country is an opportunity, and I think that partnerships will grow. I take issue with Mr. Taylor's piece in the op-ed where he talked about, you do French and we'll do German and we'll exchange students, and that brings me to the second point, the problem of that institutions aren't so nimble. So institutional coordination or sharing, I think, is I wouldn't say it's impossible. I think it's something where there has to be a lot of thought, and I don't know how can be solved in something like the United States. What I just wanted to say, which links back to what Professor Yu said, what's interesting about the Chinese experiments and of these last 10 years is how systematically, in many ways, they've turned to American higher education, turned things that we did on a smaller scale, and as we say, scaled up, and have can do it. So one of the things we had our conversation is, I am interested to see to what extent American educators and planners will look to other countries for models, because actually I think most of the conversation is, we are the best, they're coming to learn how we do it. I no longer think we're the best, and I do think that maybe that's another piece. But the bottom line is partnership on a small scale, one-to-one, is very easy, gets easier every year. If I take my 30 years and look what happened, fantastic. I want to do this, phone calls, email, and we've got our team and we're going.
Let me ask Jim to challenge this a bit. I mean, every ranking of quality, world-class universities, the U.S. leads in that league table. Deborah's point is that at this point in history, we have more to learn than to teach. Would you agree? Or is that, to putting it in football terms doesn't help?
I think she has a good point. I don't really believe in league tables, U.S. News and World Report.
Beware.
I think that I was a member of the notorious Spellings Commission. And one of my colleagues on that commission, Bob Zemsky from the University of Pennsylvania, you may know as, kind of deplored the fact that the Spellings Commission, which was an opportunity to step back.
Perhaps you could just explain to folks what the Spellings Commission
was launched by Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings, although some people suggested it was a leave no university behind, like leave no child behind. It really was supposed to look at a series of issues, including accessibility, affordability, accountability, and quality. But the problem was it simply submitted a report, dropped it on the desktop, and then the Department of Education and others in the administration went off their own merry way, kind of ignoring much of the report, taking the parts they wanted. My colleague Bob Zemsky points to the sharp contrast between that and the Bologna process, It was not a report. It's been a decade-long process used initially to drive integration of the European community.
Perhaps a word about the Bologna
process. But the Bologna process itself is a way to pull together thousands of institutions across Europe with standard degree programs, standard structures, so that students could move from one to another, perhaps create a market for faculty, trying to imitate to some degree the best features of the United States. And since it was a process involving many constituents, including, I might add, the faculty very much, and students who post-tested each of their meetings in succession, they could fine-tune it as they moved ahead. And it has been so successful that they're now moving into the second decade of it. Maybe that's the kind of a process we need to launch in this country right now, to learn from that kind of a dialogue, which of the very many constituencies which are involved, rather than to study and submit a report and have it sink beneath the waves.
Enrique?
Yes, on this topic, and more related to some of the work at the graduate school I've had, I think part of this reflection and learning process could also include the following idea. As part of this process of globalization, and there's this best-selling book of The World is Flat, no? Standardization and massification. No? At the end, we end up in economics with exactly the same courses in Beijing, in Mexico City, and Harvard. The only difference is who teaches that. No? So I would say that's a very bad way of globalizations and massification. I would say the world is more round than ever. No? If we do it, this is if we are able to include courses, higher education from a local perspective. This is including global and local activities and processes, including our community, social activities, etc. If globalization in higher education means we're going to teach the same in sociology, in sciences, in economics, exactly the same, I would say that's the poorest way of higher education we can imagine, because we will end up, well, who teaches it less expensively, no? So if that's the next step, then that would be very perverse and very poor. I think I would, and this is what is happening, as I met, the pressure to work in this direction is amazing. In our school, for example, we teach political economy, and that makes us a very strange group in economics in the graduate school, but it's amazing how many people come from all over the world to our graduate school to have a bit of diversity, because you cannot get it in a group of countries. No?
I mean, this is an extraordinarily interesting notion, and it has to do with the homogenization, flat earth aspects, and the appeal of the round. One of the things that's most remarkable about higher education, pretty much globally, is the way in which it has become more career-oriented, the ways in which what we used to think of as the liberal arts have begun to disappear. In the 1950s, 70% of U.S. college degrees were issued by liberal arts colleges. Last year it was 3%. These numbers, that number is pretty clear. This is a little murkier, but by most accounting, 10, 11, 12% of the majors in the United States, in the most broadly defined way of liberal arts, major in that. Everyone else is majoring in professional programs, in computational research, accountancy. And these then become, in some ways, a kind of flattening element in which what one worries about in many ways with globalization is the loss of the local, the loss of the specific. Is this just an English professor worrying about these things? I mean, Jim Engel at Harvard says that the humanities are the pensioners of the sciences. And I wish we got better pensions, is what was my response. But is this a legitimate concern, or is this just some kind of troglodyte response?
It's really interesting. the rest of the world looks on the United States, in particular, at our capacity to innovate, which really is the core competency. And where does that come from? We're almost unique in the world in having this general education, liberal arts character at some stage of undergraduate education. You know, the old saying is, the purpose of an undergraduate education is not to prepare you for your first job, but for your last job, okay? Now, we've lost some of that, but once again, the rest of the world is kind of learning from us and then implementing. And I think of Singapore, which has been one of the most strategic approaches to higher education. What are they doing right now? Not building another major research institute, they're building a liberal arts college to see if they can understand what its real impact is. Going back to the Spellings Commission for a moment, I think the most profound recommendation in it, which everyone ignored, was the recognition that we are moving into a world, into a society, in which lifelong learning will become a necessity for all people and an obligation of all democratic societies, which means that people, it'll make less and less difference what you study early in your life as long as you prepare yourself to continue to learn and relearn again throughout your life. Shifting careers, shifting jobs, shifting your place in society and so forth. That's a different world, okay? That challenges universities that are focused on the young, because in reality, someone has to provide those opportunities for all of our society. And to me, what we call a liberal arts education really is the foundation that gives you the capacity to do that. And I think some of the rest of the world is beginning to explore this idea.
Is this a question for your colleagues at Chinese universities, Lizhong?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting to see in China now. It's actually the university has a different attitude towards the liberal arts. More university, we say that it's a local supported university, tend to be more specialized, or they provide the training for the students. It's more, we call it professional or specialized to meet the requirement of the job market. But for some group of the university, especially for the top university, the leading university, it tends to be go to the more liberal arts called the courses. Like Fudan University, you know, they have all the students that go into the university. The first 2 years is in the College of Liberal Arts, and then to the third year and the fourth year, and then divided into different specialized. In our university, we also offer many courses in the first year and the second year. It's more based on the liberal arts. So we think that is to build up the potential for the student for future development. Because quite a number of our university, maybe I say 40% of our undergraduate students, eventually they will go to the postgraduate study in the future. So we think it's most important for us to give more solid the basis for our undergraduate students for their future career.
How does that map in the non-elite universities? Is there a careerist edge there as opposed to the more liberal arts orientation you just described?
You mean the, sorry?
Outside of those universities that have been marked as worthy of special investment.
Yes.
Is there, for those universities, for students who have not gained admission to Fudan, say, or to your university, is there a tendency there to emphasize career training?
That's right. Yes. I think, you see, even for the structure of the university or the department of the department and the school, they intend to make the name of the department, the major, is more close to what's the market, the job market required. So that is easy for the student find a job when they graduate. And also they have a more close link with the industry for training the student.
Let me conclude our conversation with the inevitable vision question, the H.G. Wells shape of things to come question. How do you see higher education at mid-century? I mean, this is from your individual positions. Jim, let me start with you.
I have this curse that I tend to look over the horizon to some degree. But what and therefore usually falsely predict the future. But let me put several data points in front of you. The Economist estimates right now that there are 3.5 billion cell phone contracts in the world. Now, maybe a lot of people, 3.5 billion. Now, maybe a lot of people have more than one cell phone contract. But the reality is, within 10 years, the majority of the world's population will have at least cell phone connectivity at 3G, 4G broadband speed. Data point number one. Data point number two, my university is the lead university in what's called the Google Book Scan project. Yeah. Google is scanning our library. They're about 2/3 through and scanning an 8 million volume library. They'll finish in 2010. We're one of 25 universities around the world that they're scanning, including all the Big Ten. They won't tell you how many they've scanned so far, but we think it's well above 10 million. Those 25 libraries represent, if they were to scan their complete collections, about 60% of the printed material in the world today. Okay? Now, although they're scanning and making available full-text searches, not allowing you to read everything, but at least know where it is, there have recently been negotiations with publishers that will provide full-text access to much of that. So that's the second point. The third point is that the faculty on many of our campuses are now beginning to realize that knowledge, their teaching activities and so forth, is something that should be given away to the world as a public good. This started at MIT with what they call the Open Courseware Initiative, where the digital assets undergirding all 2,000 of their courses are now online and available to anybody. Okay? There are now 400 universities around the world, 7,000 courses. Yale is streaming its 30 most popular courses in high-quality video. My university is putting its entire medical curriculum on the web, primarily for sub-Saharan Africa. So that's the third data point. So imagine a world, not simply in the lifetime of our students, but in your lifetime, increasing 100 to 1,000-fold in power, decade after decade after decade. Okay? Virtual reality. Am I real or a hologram? Well, 10 to 20 years, you won't be able to tell. Yeah. So over the last 10 years, what we've seen, I mean, we can question what's the future of the university, what's the future of the corporation, the nation state. But I think much more interesting is the question, what kind of spontaneous immersion of social institutions will occur? Google, Amazon, Al-Qaeda, things we can't even imagine. Good and bad. Okay, that's our future. And that's the future we have to somehow shape and prepare people for. What's a university in that future? I don't know. But since it's based on knowledge, we do have some role.
Yeah. Enrique, real hologram?
Not yet.
Good, bad?
Not yet.
How do you see the future, my friend?
Look, I could imagine two extreme scenarios. No? One scenario would be, I would say, based on my experience also here in the US, but also in Germany, France, and in Latin America. I would say one scenario would be to keep on going with the increasing privatization, and again, thinking that knowledge-intensive and capital-intensive socioeconomies in the future will be critical. No? So if we go on with this privatization process, we will go on also and deepen the current dramatic process of polarization. This is the have-nots and the have will increase. No? Why? Because the public sector will have an ever-decreasing role, and the people that are able to invest for an education in the Ivy League will do it, and the rest will not do it. So gaps will increase dramatically. A more hopeful, some might say wishful thinking, would be that the university increasingly is able to link innovations, knowledge with the rest of the economy. This is that universities and these institutions are not degree-making institutions. You achieve your PhD or whatever, that's it, next one. That's not the final result, But as you said and as you mentioned an ongoing process, and maybe you don't need a PhD, but you need a lot of diplomas of weekends, seminars, etc. And this is much more relevant than someone that had a PhD 30 years ago, and it might be not that useful today, maybe. No? So this would, again, this linking between the public sector, private sector, academics is, I believe, a critical role, and I don't see that other institutions, today at least, might be able to have this role and this function.
Thank you. Deborah, your shot.
The vision that you outlined is one of increasing individuation, and I share this polarization, and I think it's the opportunity for universities. That is, we are a place where people gather. We are a place where we create new ways of doing things, thinking things through. You know, the engineer creating something no one ever imagined is how we define the engineer. But I think this is why it's so critical, and why I think in a way I feel in China has a certain advantage. That is, at the top, they think strategic thinking about thinking is the nation's future. And so whatever it is, going to be 7 billion Kindles out there, is really an opportunity, but unless it's put in a context right now and as we move along, I think it could be quite scary. And the point that I would say, this polarization is working where I do. Yes, the students get better and better and better and better, and they can do incredibly much. And the gap between those students and the students in the New Haven schools is far greater than it was 30 years ago.
Lizhong, final word is yours.
2 points. The first, I think, the innovation is the driving forces for the knowledge-based economy in the future. So the university will play more and more important role, I think, in the 21st century. The second is, if we say globalization is a tendency of the world, internationalization is the strategy or the response of the university. So I do think the university cooperations will become more and more important. That is, I think, the way to share the resources and share the human knowledge, which has already developed. I do believe that is all the university leaders, if they are clever enough, it's very important to make a great effort to make your university it's more internationalized. In ECNU, we have already developed a global education center. Actually, we use part of our campus, become a global campus. We have introduced the international universities to come to set up their center, the overseas campus in our university. NYU has 3 years ago, they have their Shanghai center in our university. So every year they will send 200 or 300 students into our university to join with the Chinese university, and we share the courses together. And EM Lyon also set up their overseas campus in our university. So all the MBA students, it's relevant to the Asia. They will stay in our university for the whole semester. So I do hope ECNU can become a window of Shanghai, of China. So people can use the window to approach, to understand the Shanghai and understand the China. And also we can share the sources of the high quality, high education resources for our students. Even they don't need to go out of the country, but they still can have more opportunity to mix, to contact with the students from all over the world. And also they can share the high quality education resources. So I think that is the way, if we think about the future of the higher education, the people will become more and more close, and we will much more to use our common resources for the future development.
Thank you. My friends, please thank our friends for this extraordinarily stimulating conversation. Thank you for being with us.